The desolate stretch. The wagons, now 46 strong and bound by a shared tense pragmatism, had traversed the gentle descent from the South Pass, only to encounter the final cruel reality of the Great Basin, the desolate stretch. This area, south of the Snake River and hundreds of miles from the Oregon border, was a geographic nightmare. A vast expanse of volcanic ash, alkali flats, and brackish water, where the sun was a punishing, malevolent eye in a relentless blue sky. This was the chapter of the journey that broke all rules, a test of pure, unyielding human endurance against environmental nihilism. The White Terror, alkali, and thirst. The primary challenge of this stretch was not the mountains, but the alkali poison. The only water sources were brackish mineral-laden pools or slow, muddy streams contaminated by the white, crystalline powder of alkali that lay like a deceptive dusting of snow across the ground. The first victim was a yoke of oxen from the second cohort. They drank from an inviting-looking clear pool and collapsed hours later in agonizing spasms, their insides scorched by the mineral salts. Captain Jedediah Stone immediately issued a desperate decree. No animal drinks from any water source without the captain's or Doc Healy's explicit inspection. Thomas Hale, now the doctor's right hand, rode ahead with Healy, their mission a matter of life and death, locating a reliable, non-poisonous water source. "The good water lies deep," Hale explained, his voice strained by the heat. He was in constant pain from his shoulder, but his mind remained sharp. "The shallow pools are death. We must find the pockets where the springs are fed by the old snowmelt, where the water has filtered through the good rock." Their days became a hellish cycle of search, disappointment, and fear. They would dismount and test water sources, Thomas using his hands to scoop up the liquid, Healy testing it with a crude piece of litmus paper, or in a pinch, cautiously tasting the slightest drop. The metallic, bitter taste of alkali became the taste of the trail. The thirst siege. The train soon entered a stretch of over 50 miles where all water was poisoned. The captain was forced to ration the meager supply they carried in their barrels. Ration, 1 pint of water per person per day. For the livestock, only a few mouthfuls to prevent complete collapse. The thirst was a living thing, a physical torment that robbed the pioneers of their sanity. Lips cracked, tongues swelled, and eyes became bloodshot and dry. The oxen moved with a desperate, heavy lurch, their lungs rattling with every breath. Thomas, enduring the thirst on the saddle, was plagued with visions of his sister, Clara, offering him a cool dipper of well water. He remembered the simple, casual luxury of an ordinary cup of clean water in Cincinnati, and the memory was more agonizing than the dry heat. He began to understand that the true value of civilization was not gold, but the free availability of clean water. The test of the Vances, famine and sacrifice. The famine, already severe, was amplified by the lack of game. The sagebrush desert held no life save for the occasional sickly jackrabbit that was too quick or too small to be worth the precious powder. The Vances, Thomas's adoptive cohort, began to suffer. Elias was weakened by the perpetual labor, his energy sapped by the constant thirst. Sarah Vance, forced to stretch their thin gruel, grew alarmingly pale. The crisis came to a head when their 2-year-old, little Amy Vance, began to fail. The child, dehydrated and malnourished, slipped into a high fever. Doc Healy, grim and professional, examined her. "It is the fever of deprivation, Sarah, not the cholera. Her little body is consuming itself. She needs protein and she needs clean fluid. We have neither." Sarah, tears finally escaping her stoic reserve, looked at Thomas, her eyes pleading. Thomas knew what he had to do. His own supplies were almost gone. traded for the Vance's protection. He had nothing left but his rifle, a few charges of powder, and his small Cooper's chisels and Clara's apple preserves, the single last piece of the East he still possessed. He walked to Elias's wagon, his heart heavy with the weight of the sacrifice. He took the small jar of preserves, the sweet, precious symbol of his sister's love and his past life. He returned to Healy. "Doctor, this is all I have, pure sugar and fruit. Can it help?" Healy uncorked the jar, looked at the contents, a dense, beautiful concentration of energy, and nodded slowly. "It is a miracle, Thomas, enough sugar to shock the child's system back into the fight. But it is only a single dose, and you have given up your last food reserve." Sarah Vance watched Thomas as he offered his final comfort to her daughter. She understood the magnitude of the sacrifice. He had traded the last tangible piece of his home, his memory of his sister, and his remaining food reserve for the life of her child. The small amount of apple preserve, diluted with a few drops of clean water and carefully spoon-fed by Sarah, was enough. Little Amy's fever broke the next morning. The small child lived, but Thomas had been stripped to the bone. He now possessed nothing but his clothes on his back, his rifle, his tools, and a life debt to the Vances he could never fully repay.
The betrayal of the map. As the train crawled deeper into the Great Basin, another betrayal emerged, the lie of the maps. The maps they carried, drawn from earlier exploratory expeditions, were terrifyingly inaccurate. Water sources were marked where none existed. Rivers shown as flowing were nothing but dry, cracked beds of clay. Jedediah Stone, relying on his instincts in the sun, admitted the truth to Thomas and Elias. "We are in uncharted territory, boys. The map is a beautiful piece of fiction. From here on, we follow the only reliable compass, the direction of the river canyons." The desperation led to a dangerous relaxation of the rules, a compromise that Jedediah had previously forbidden. To save time, they were forced to march late into the night, risking exhaustion and disorganization. The night sky, normally a source of wonder, became a hostile, deceptive cloak. The night of the dust storm. One evening, after an arduous moonless march, a massive dust storm descended upon the train. It came without warning, a colossal, choking curtain of fine volcanic silt and sand driven by a gale-force wind. The train instantly disintegrated into chaos. The oxen, blinded and terrified, bolted. The wind tore the canvas covers from the wagons. Men, unable to see 2 feet in front of their faces, became disoriented, losing contact with their cohort. Thomas was separated from the Vances, lost in a terrifying blackness. He heard the distant panic shouts of other pioneers, their cries immediately snatched away by the wind. He fell to his knees, burying his face in his arms, the grit stinging his eyes and invading his lungs. He was utterly alone, adrift in a suffocating world of dust. It was Doc Healy who saved him. Healy, unable to see but relying on his keen hearing, shouted Thomas's name in a strange low frequency that cut through the storm's roar. "Hale! Keep low! Follow my voice! We must find a windbreak!" Thomas crawled toward the sound, stumbling upon Healy, who was sheltering behind a low basalt rock. The doctor, using his belt, tied his wrist to Thomas's. "We move together, Hale. We will not be buried alive. We crawl." They spent hours tied together, inching their way forward until they found the vague, comforting outline of a wagon, the sturdy rig of Esther Jenkins. The morning revealed the disaster. 3 wagons were gone, simply vanished into the dust. Worse, the livestock were scattered. They had lost 7 valuable oxen and 2 horses, their tracks entirely erased by the storm. The price paid in time. The losses were crippling. The train was forced to spend 3 full days searching for the missing livestock, an agonizing halt that consumed their precious time. Every hour lost meant winter was closer. Thomas, exhausted but alive, sat with Jedediah Stone as they calculated the cost of the desolate stretch. "We have lost a week to the storm and the alkali, Hale," the captain said, scraping a line in the dirt. "Our supplies will not last to the settlements. We have 300 miles of barren country left before we reach the Cascades. We can't travel more than 10 miles a day or we break the remaining animals." The final bitter reality of the desolate stretch was not that it killed people, but that it stole their time, the non-renewable resource that determined their survival against the coming snows. Thomas looked at his hands, no longer blistered, but worn and deeply lined. He had lost his independence, his animal, his memory of home, and he had nearly lost his life in the dust. He had nothing left to lose but the journey itself. "Captain," Thomas said, his voice flat with resolve, "we can't afford 10 miles a day. We will break camp an hour earlier. We will rest an hour less. We will walk until the animals collapse, and we will not stop for anything but water. We must trade our bodies for time. It is the only coin we have left." Jedediah Stone looked at the Cooper-turned-pioneer, a man who had been stripped of everything but his will. He saw the cold, hard logic of survival in Thomas's eyes. "Agreed, Hale. We trade our sleep for the snow line. Tell the cohorts, we begin the fast march at dawn." The desolate stretch had been the great consumer. It had forced the ultimate sacrifice of the self, leaving the train weak, but with an iron clarity. Their final goal could only be reached by an act of sheer, relentless will. The trail had taken everything. Now it was time for the survivors to take the land by force of movement.
Betrayal in the camp. The fast march, driven by Thomas Hale's desperate calculus to outrun the winter snows, had pushed the Oregon train of 45 to its absolute breaking point. The landscape had reluctantly transitioned from the sterile Great Basin to the rugged, timbered slopes leading toward the Blue Mountains, the last great barrier before the descent into the Columbia River settlements. Exhaustion was now a perpetual state, and the lack of sleep had frayed every nerve ending in the train. Captain Jedediah Stone was gaunt, his authority strained by the unrelenting pace. Morale was held together by the thin thread of discipline and the promise of salvation just beyond the peaks. It was in this environment of total physical and mental fatigue that the most dangerous enemy of all emerged: betrayal. The tipping point: weariness and neglect. The relentless marching demanded flawless execution of the night watch, but weariness was now a greater threat than any human foe. The guards, Thomas, Elias, and 2 others, walked their shifts like ghosts, fighting the heavy pull of sleep. One night, the cold was particularly biting. They had camped in a sheltered, steep-sided valley, a place that offered good wind protection, but poor sight lines. Elias Vance was on the second watch, from midnight to 4 a.m., the watch of deepest sleep. Elias had been suffering from a nagging cough and a fever for days, the exhaustion finally pulling his large frame down. He had been struggling to keep his post, staggering in the darkness. He had even approached his wife Sarah earlier that evening. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice rough, "I cannot keep the watch tonight. I'll fall asleep on my feet. I need Thomas to cover me." "You know Thomas is covering the next shift and is working the forge all evening. He is near collapse himself. You must take your post, Elias. Lie down for an hour before your shift and drink this tonic Doc Healy gave you." Elias did take the tonic, but the laudanum in it, meant to calm his cough, only deepened his fatigue. He staggered out to his post, a small rise overlooking the mule pen. The cold was a dull ache. He walked his perimeter twice, then leaned against a large boulder for just a moment to rest his burning eyes. The moment stretched to 5 minutes, then 10. The relentless strain of the entire journey, the loss of his home, the anxiety for his children, the terrifying sickness, all coalesced into a heavy, suffocating sleep. Elias Vance, the pillar of the cohort, fell asleep on guard duty. The opportunity and the theft. The betrayal did not come from an external enemy, but from within the remnants of the train's greed. Silas Thorne. Since the river crossing, the disgraced senator had been the train's ditch digger, a miserable, isolated figure forced into back-breaking labor. He was clothed in rags, hungry, and consumed by a cold, burning resentment for Jedediah Stone, and especially for Thomas Hale, who had ensured his continued humiliation. But Silas Thorne was an opportunist. He had seen the weakening of Elias, the exhaustion of the guards, and he knew where the opportunity lay. He still carried a single secret ambition: to find his way to the coast and somehow regain his position and wealth. To do that, he needed transport and supplies. In the dead center of the camp were the most vital, irreplaceable assets: the captain's reserve oxen and Doc Healy's medical stock. Silas had noticed that in his humiliation, no one checked his watch schedule. When Elias's deep, ragged breathing confirmed the guard was down, Silas moved. He moved silently, driven by a desperate, selfish logic. He first crept to the pen and cut the ropes on Jedediah's two prized reserve oxen, the strongest, healthiest animals in the entire train. He drove them quietly out of the camp, through the unguarded gap in the circle and toward the darkness of the surrounding woods. He then returned to the center. Thomas had taught him the value of the medical stock. Healy's quinine, his laudanum, and his crude surgical instruments were worth more than gold. Silas forced the lock on Healy's pack saddle, his heart hammering with greed. He stuffed the most valuable vials and the silver surgical kit, the instruments of life, into a satchel. His final act of pure selfishness was the cruelest. He crept to Elias Vance's wagon and stole the remaining food reserves of the cohort: 2 pounds of flour, a small piece of salted pork, and the Vance's single beloved coffee grinder. He left Elias sleeping soundly against the boulder, oblivious to the disaster unfolding. The discovery and the fury. Thomas Hale awoke at 4 a.m. for the final watch. He walked toward Elias's post, expecting to tap him on the shoulder and send him back to bed. He found Elias asleep, slumped over the boulder, his head resting against the cold stone. Thomas's blood ran cold. The sight of the negligence was a gut punch. He shook Elias violently awake. "Elias, here is the stock. Did you see anything?" Elias awoke, confused and instantly ashamed. I must have slept, Thomas. Just a moment. I'm sorry." They rushed to the pen. The reserve oxen were gone. The ropes were cut, and the gap in the wagon circle was open, a glaring, unforgivable mistake. The alarm was raised with a single terrified cry: "Cattle rustled! Guards failed!" Captain Jedediah Stone arrived at the pen, taking in the evidence of the cut rope, the missing animals, and the sight of Elias Vance, pale and weeping with shame. But it was the discovery of the pilfered medical stock from Doc Healy's pack that turned the captain's rage into lethal focus. "This was not a raid, Elias," Jedediah said, his voice quiet, devoid of fury, which made it terrifying. "A raider takes the stock and runs. A raider does not stop to steal a man's coffee grinder and a doctor's surgical kit. This was an emigrant. This was betrayal." It took only minutes to put the pieces together. Silas Thorne's ditch-digging shovel was found near the open gap. The last sighting of the reserve oxen was near Thorne's last post, and a quick check of Thorne's own bedding confirmed the obvious: he was gone. The loss was catastrophic.
The 2 reserve oxen were the safety net against the final, steepest climb into the Blue Mountains. Without them, any single ox failure meant a stall, and a stall meant death in the coming snow. The theft of the medical supplies meant the loss of their only effective defense against disease and injury. The internal conflict had become externalized through a moment of moral collapse. The manhunt and the moral line. Jedediah Stone gathered the men and issued a clear, brutal command. Silas Thorne has sentenced this entire train to death for his own selfish gain. He must be caught. If we lose the animals, we die. Thomas Hale, Doc Healy, you ride. You are the fastest and you know the terrain. Bring back the oxen. Bring back the supplies. If Thorne resists, you know what to do. The meaning was clear. The life of one man was worth nothing compared to the survival of the 45 remaining wagons. Thomas, his alliance with Healy now tested under fire, mounted Healy's fastest horse. Doc Healy, despite his still healing shoulder, was grimly determined. "He stole the quinine, Thomas," Healy muttered as they rode out into the cold dawn. "He took the last defense against fever. He has to be stopped." They tracked Thorne for hours through the rocky terrain. The trail of the 2 heavy oxen and the fugitive was easy to follow. They found the first sign of Thorne's moral decay when they found the Vance's coffee grinder, smashed on a rock, a petty, needless act of spite against the people who had offered them charity. They finally cornered Thorne late in the afternoon in a hidden grove by a small spring. He was trying to hitch the oxen to a makeshift harness, the stolen supplies scattered at his feet. "Halt, Senator!" Thomas yelled, leveling his rifle. Thorne spun around, a small Derringer pistol, his last desperate trinket of his former life, clutched in his hand. His face was a wild mix of fear and maniacal relief. "Stay back, Hale. I'm taking the beasts. I deserve them. I lost everything at the river." "You lost everything because you were a fool, Thorne," Thomas said, his voice hard. "You chose a mirror over a strong wagon. You chose a music box over diplomacy. Now you choose the lives of 50 people over your own miserable hide. Drop the pistol." Thorne, driven mad by the prospect of failure and the harsh judgment in Thomas's eyes, raised the Derringer and fired. The tiny pistol shot was loud but inaccurate, the bullet kicking up dirt 10 feet from Thomas's boot. Before Thomas could fire his rifle, Doc Healy reacted. He pulled his double-barreled shotgun from the saddle. The force of the blast, even with his injured shoulder, was immense. The spray of buckshot struck the ground beside Thorne, not hitting him directly, but showering him with sharp stones and dirt, a powerful, terrifying warning. Thorne dropped the pistol and collapsed, weeping hysterically, utterly broken. The price of reconciliation. Thomas and Healy secured the oxen and the stolen medical supplies. They did not touch the senator. "We leave him here, Doctor," Thomas said, his voice flat. "He has no food, no water, and he has wasted his last powder. The trail will deliver the final judgment." "No," Healy shook his head, looking at the cowering man. "The train needs to see the consequence, Hale. We do not bury our sins in the desert. We drag them back for the lesson." They dragged Silas Thorne back to the main camp, trussed like an animal and tied to the back of the restored reserve oxen. The meeting that night was the final tribunal of the journey. Jedediah Stone was absolute. Thorne was stripped of his name, his pistol, and his dignity. His life was spared only because his labor, digging ditches and carrying water, was still marginally useful. But the real transformative lesson was the reconciliation between Thomas and Elias Vance. Elias, still trembling with shame and fever, walked to Thomas. "Thomas, I cost us our lives. I betrayed my post. I failed my family. I failed you." Thomas looked at his friend, seeing the profound, raw sorrow in his eyes. He saw a moment of human failure, not an act of malice. "You failed, Elias," Thomas said, laying a hand on his heavy shoulder. "But your exhaustion was the fault of the trail, not your heart. Thorne's act was one of choice, born of greed. You chose to fight the fever. He chose to save himself. We all carry that same load, Elias. Now you must carry the extra burden of your shame and turn it into strength. You are needed." Thomas's quiet absolution restored Elias's soul, forging a new, deeper bond between the two men, a partnership built on shared failure and forgiveness. The betrayal in the camp had nearly killed them, but in the end, it did what the high country could not. It defined the moral boundaries of the community. They had learned that the ultimate price of progress was not supplies or life, but the constant, necessary vigilance against the most dangerous threat of all, the greed and selfishness harbored in the human heart. They moved on, their column tightened, their discipline absolute, forever marked by the shame and the survival of the betrayal. A glimmer of the Promised Land. The betrayal of Silas Thorne and the subsequent brutal fast march had extracted the final ounce of energy from the Oregon train of 45. They had pushed through the jagged, dark slopes of the Blue Mountains, driven only by the constant, chilling fear of the early winter snows that began to dust the high passes. Captain Jedediah Stone's face was drawn and hollow. His oxen, though healthy, were gaunt, and the emigrants moved like automatons, their eyes fixed only on the dusty boot in front of them. Thomas Hale and Doc Healy, united by their secret covenant, performed their duties with a cold efficiency. They were the engine of forward motion, their pragmatism shielding the others from complete collapse. Elias Vance, restored to honor by Thomas's forgiveness, walked tirelessly beside his wagon, a shadow of his former self, but fiercely resolute. And then, just when the relentless monotony of survival threatened to consume their very will, the landscape performed a profound, miraculous transformation. The break in the barrier. They had been inching their way down a steep, treacherous path, the wagons often having to be rough-locked, wheels chained to prevent rotation, to stop them from running away on the grade. The air was dry, and the terrain was still rocky, but Thomas noticed the scent first, a profound, earthy fragrance that was not dust, pine, or sagebrush. It was the smell of wet, fertile soil and distant moisture. They rounded a final, sharp bend in the trail, and the world opened up. Before them, stretching out to a soft, haze-filled horizon, was the valley of the Columbia River. The effect was immediate and stunning. The relentless gray of the desert was gone, replaced by a lush, deep green. Towering pines gave way to broadleaf trees, and the dry, parched earth beneath their feet yielded to thick, yielding sod. The entire train, the exhausted oxen, the exhausted mules, the half-starved humans, came to an immediate, unplanned halt. No one spoke. They simply stood, staring at the vision of the valley. "Look," Sarah Vance whispered, her voice cracking with pure, overwhelming relief. "The air, it's soft." Thomas stood beside her, his breath catching in his throat. The light here was different. It was golden and filtered, a gentle caress after the harsh, blinding glare of the high desert. The great dark shadow of the mountain range was behind them, and before them lay a green and promised land, the very image of the future he had staked his life on. This was the glimmer of the Promised Land, not the final destination, but the moment of certainty. They had made it through the wall. The turning point, water and nourishment. The psychological relief was instantly compounded by the physical evidence of salvation. They reached the bank of a swift-flowing stream, not the murky, alkali-laced sludge of the basin, but a clean, cold ribbon of water tumbling down from the mountains. The animals, sensing the life-giving water, went mad. The teamsters could barely restrain the oxen as they rushed to drink. Water salvation. Thomas knelt by the stream and plunged his hands into the current. He brought the cold water to his lips and drank deeply. It was the most exquisite taste he had ever known, the taste of purity, of survival, of a fresh start. He splashed it over his face, washing away the layers of dust and exhaustion that had coated him for months. "Healy!" Thomas called out, his voice thick with emotion. "It's clean! We've made it!" Doc Healy, who had ridden up slowly, nodded, but his focus was already elsewhere. He was examining the riverbanks, his mind immediately turning to the next problem: nourishment. "Water is life, but the animals need more than water," Healy said, pointing to the thick, succulent grass that grew everywhere. "They need the sugar from that grass. The children need protein. We must stop here for 2 full days. We must rebuild the engines of this train, or we risk breaking down in the final descent." Jedediah Stone, without a word, simply gave a weary nod. Discipline on the spot was abandoned. The wagons were pulled into a loose circle, and the pioneers immediately focused on 2 things: grazing the animals and searching for food. The return of forage. The next 48 hours were a frenzy of restorative activity. The men hunted small game, deer and fowl, which were plentiful in the well-watered valley. The meat was boiled and distributed, a life-saving infusion of protein to the starving children and the exhausted adults. Thomas, using his small cooper's chisels, fashioned crude wooden troughs to ensure the oxen could feed and water efficiently. He watched Goliath's replacement, the mule he was now riding, gorge itself on the rich grass, its ribs slowly disappearing under a thin layer of muscle. Sarah Vance, her face bright with hope, baked the last of their flour into proper bread, sharing it with Elizabeth Blackwood, whose spirit was slowly returning now that her future was certain. The taste of true food, after months of gruel and hardtack, was a celebration in itself. Renewed hope and the cost of the past. The rest period was not just physical, it was a profound spiritual and emotional restoration. The healing of the cohort. The internal tensions began to ease with the return of comfort. The sight of the green valley was a collective forgiveness. Elias Vance, his energy returning, worked tirelessly to mend the remaining damaged wheels, his strength restored by the lifting of his shame. Even Silas Thorne, still relegated to the back of the train and watched by Esther Jenkins, seemed to regain a measure of sanity. The constant gnawing hunger and the terror of being abandoned had finally broken his arrogance. He performed his tasks silently, his eyes holding no resentment, only a dull, fearful obedience. The Green Valley offered him a chance to survive his own moral failure, but it could not restore his lost status. The unspoken bond. Thomas spent the evening sitting with Doc Healy, cleaning his instruments and listening to the doctor's quiet professional observations about the land. Their alliance, born of blood and necessity, was now a stable, essential partnership. "The air is clean, Thomas," Healy remarked, looking up at the sky, which was now filled with proper clouds, promising rain. "This is the land that feeds. It is what they promised in the pamphlets. And you, Doctor, does this land feel like freedom to you, or just a different prison?" Healy paused, looking out over the valley. "The law does not follow the scent of rain, Thomas. It follows paper. When we reach the Columbia, I will sell my medical kit for passage north to the Canadian territory. The air is clean, and the law there is indifferent." Thomas nodded, understanding the doctor's rootless necessity. Healy's promised land was not a plot of soil, but a lack of jurisdiction. The final descent, the horizon of the future. On the morning of the third day, the train prepared for its final departure. They were a different group, still battered, but their movements were energized, their steps springier, their voices louder. They had survived the worst, and the reward was visible just beyond the next rise. Jedediah Stone stood before the train, his eyes shining with exhaustion and triumph. "You are here," he announced, his voice hoarse. "You have crossed the mountains and the desert. You have survived the fever, the thief, and the quicksand. From here, we follow the last rivers. We are days, not weeks, from the first settlement, but the trail will fight us to the end. The final descent is steep, and the river must be navigated. No celebration until the wheels stop turning and the yoke is permanently unhitched."
Jedediah, temporarily paralyzed by the enormity of the disaster, simply nodded, his eyes wide with fear. He then looked at the line of the blue mountains behind them, the monstrous wall they had just defeated. "Look back once," he commanded. "Look at what you have conquered. Then look forward and remember what you have earned." Thomas looked back at the receding, jagged peaks. The mountain range seemed impossibly distant, a nightmare receding into the mist of memory. He looked at his hands, the hands of a cooper, a fighter, a survivor, and felt a profound sense of self-creation. The old Thomas Hale had died in the Great Basin. The man who stood here, scarred and ready, was the pioneer. He mounted his replacement mule, adjusting the reins. He took one last deep breath of the damp, fertile air of the valley. "Ready, Elias?" Thomas asked. Elias Vance, his great chest now filled with clean air, smiled. A genuine, hopeful smile, the first Thomas had seen in months. "Ready, Thomas. Let's finish this." The train moved out, a short, tight, and unified column, rolling forward into the valley. The dust was gone, replaced by soft mud. The fear was gone, replaced by a fierce, driving hope. The glimmer of the promised land had restored their souls, giving them the final strength to endure the last, desperate push toward the valley of the Willamette. The land was calling them home.
The final push, crossing the divide. The brief respite in the valley had been a necessary pause, but it was over. The renewed hope it had instilled was now sharpened into a single, terrifying imperative: speed. They were running on borrowed time. The calendar hung over the Oregon train of 45 like the executioner's axe. It was early October, and the dreaded Cascades Mountains, the final colossal barrier, lay ahead. The winter snows, lethal and instantaneous, were expected at any moment. Captain Jedediah Stone was brutal in his clarity. "We are no longer marching, we are running," he announced before the final departure. "The snow line is our enemy. If we are caught in the Cascades, we are buried. We must push the animals and ourselves to the very limit. Every hour we gain is a life saved." This was the final push, a 20-day siege against the clock, a period of sustained, desperate effort where exhaustion was ignored and discipline became a matter of pure, mechanical will. The race against the sky. The trail immediately became a harrowing trial of steep, slippery inclines and terrifying, muddy descents. They were following the last major tributary westward, a path that was not a road but a game trail, rocky, narrow, and often running precariously along the edge of sheer drops. The pace. The train's pace was maniacal. They started before dawn, pushing the weary oxen and mules until well past dark. Meals were consumed on the march. Rest was taken in staggered 2-hour shifts. Thomas Hale, now riding Healy's strong pack mule, was Jedediah's primary advance scout and pace setter.
He and Doc Healy rode ahead, finding the easiest lines of travel, constantly pushing the limit of speed without breaking the animal's will. The air was damp and cold, heavy with the scent of coming rain, and later, snow. Every evening, Thomas would look at the sky, a desperate, prayerful act. The clouds were gathering, dark and heavy, a constant threat against their survival. The burden of the oxen. The true heroes of this push were the oxen. Their endurance was magnificent, but they were working on empty reserves. Thomas and Elias spent every evening inspecting the animals' hooves, rubbing down their shoulders, and applying every scrap of remaining salve to their raw yokes. The breaking point came a week into the final push. 2 oxen, both from a single elderly couple's wagon, simply collapsed. They could not be revived. The captain's ruling was immediate and pitiless. The oxen are dead. We cannot stop. We redistribute the load. The burden was divided among the remaining wagons. Thomas's cohort, the Vances, Esther Jenkins, and Thomas, who now had his own small load, took the largest share of the burden. The sacrifice was necessary, but it slowed the train further, forcing them to push the remaining animals even harder. The crisis on the summit. They reached the summit at midday under a sickly, bruised-looking sky. As the first wagons crested the ridge, a change in the weather was instantaneous and terrifying. The wind dropped to an eerie silence, and the air turned heavy. "The snow!" Jedediah bellowed, his voice filled with panic. "It's coming! We have no time! Push! Push! Push!" A blinding, furious snowstorm erupted. It was not a gentle dusting, but a thick, wet snow driven by a fierce wind, instantly cutting visibility to a few feet. The temperature plummeted. The train instantly plunged into chaos. The oxen, terrified by the blizzard, struggled against the yokes. The wheels slid sideways on the icy trail, threatening to send entire wagons careening over the mountain's edge. The desperate measure. Thomas, riding Healy's mule, fought his way to the front of the column. He knew a few minutes of delay could freeze the entire train in place. "Captain, we can't move the wagons," Thomas screamed over the howling wind. "We have to lighten the load and set up a windbreak now." Thomas took command. He had the men instantly begin throwing out non-essential supplies. Anything that was not food, rifle, or warm blanket was instantly cast aside. Tools, spare parts, furniture, and even cherished sentimental items. The sound of things breaking and being tossed into the ravine, the final brutal liquidation of their possessions, was a desperate sound of survival. Elizabeth Blackwood, with a thick set, threw out the remaining fragments of her wedding china. Ilias tossed a beloved, heavy anvil. But lightening the wagons wasn't enough. The oxen kept slipping, refusing to pull. The alliance tested. Doc Healy, riding beside Thomas, suddenly grabbed Thomas's arm. "Hale, the Vances, the children are freezing. We must get them to the shelter." "We can't stay a few yards below the trail. We can't secure them. We must get the people out. I will take the children, but I need you to lead my mule back. We can use it to warm the children." Thomas, seeing the desperate logic, agreed. He and Doc Healy plunged down the snowy bank, rescuing the Vance children and others who were near collapse from the cold. They placed them in the grotto, using Healy's mule as a source of body heat. The storm raged for 3 hours, pinning the train to the summit. When it finally eased, the ground was covered in 3 feet of heavy, wet snow. Moving the wagons by oxen alone was now impossible. The captain and Thomas formulated the final desperate plan: the human chain. They unyoked the oxen entirely. The men and the strongest women, Thomas, Elias, Esther Jenkins, and Sarah Vance, formed a massive 40-person human chain. They attached ropes to the wagon tongues and began to pull the wagons down the descent by hand, one at a time, sliding them down the steep, snow-covered slope. The process was agonizingly slow and brutally dangerous. They were constantly slipping, the heavy wagons threatening to run away and drag the entire chain with them. Thomas, taking the lead position on his cohort's rope, pulled until the blood burst from his cracked palms. He was driven by the single thought, Clara's seeds are in that wagon. My future is in that wagon. We must pull. Esther Jenkins' sacrifice. During a particularly steep pitch, the lead wagon, driven by an inexperienced young emigrant, slid rapidly out of control. It was heading straight toward the human chain, threatening to crush the men at the front. Thomas screamed for everyone to jump clear, but Esther Jenkins, the old widow, stood her ground. She saw the heavy wheel coming, and with a terrifying finality, slammed the remaining heavy piece of her broken axle, a spare piece of iron Thomas had crafted for her, into the spokes of the runaway wheel. The iron splintered, but it acted as a momentary brake, just enough to slow the wagon's momentum. The wagon tilted violently, but did not crush the men. The cost, however, was immense. The final blow of the heavy axle had ruptured something vital in Esther's old body. She collapsed in the snow, her eyes wide with pain, but her expression serene. Doc Healy rushed to her, but it was too late. "She's broken inside, Thomas," Healy whispered, his face streaked with tears and snow. "She saved the line. She saved the train." They performed a quick, tearful burial on the side of the mountain, wrapping the old woman in her finest woolen blanket. Esther Jenkins had paid the final, highest price for the progress of the group. The valley and the finish line. The death of Esther Jenkins, a figure of quiet strength, infuses the remaining pioneers with a savage, cold fury. Her sacrifice would not be in vain. They pulled with a renewed, desperate strength. They continued the relentless hand-over-hand descent for another day and a half. The air slowly warmed, the snow gave way to sleet, and then, gloriously, to cold, steady rain. The pines thinned out. And then, on the evening of the 20th day of the final push, Thomas, who was still pulling the line, staggered out onto the first sight of the Willamette Valley.
The train came to an unceremonious stop in a muddy field. There were no cheers, no shouts of victory. There was only the collective, heavy sigh of release. Men and women collapsed in the mud, weeping with exhaustion and relief. Thomas Hale, his hands frozen to the rope, finally let go. He walked to Elias Vance's wagon, where Sarah was hugging her revived, confused children. "We're here, Sarah," Thomas whispered, kneeling in the mud. "We made it." Sarah Vance looked at him, her eyes burning with a deep, unbreakable gratitude. She reached into her clothes and pulled out the small linen sack. "Your seeds, Thomas," she said, placing the small, vital bag of future into his hand. "Welcome home." Thomas looked at the seeds, the wheat, the corn, the carrots, the tiny, potent symbols of his ambition. They had crossed the Great Divide, beaten the deadline, and paid the price in possessions, pride, and life. The journey was over. The pioneering had just begun.
New beginnings, enduring scars. The Willamette Valley, seen through the exhaustion-glazed eyes of the survivors, was not merely a landscape, it was a promise kept. The train, now little more than a ragged collection of battered wagons and gaunt figures, had stopped near the fledgling settlement of Oregon City. The final, bone-deep exhaustion was replaced by a kind of numb inertia. They had reached the physical end of the Oregon Trail. The first days in the valley were a blur of disorientation. The simple sight of fixed structures, a small sawmill, a proper general store, actual windows, felt alien. After months of enforced discipline, the sudden freedom was almost overwhelming. The pioneers, still smelling of dust and sickness, found themselves gawking at people who wore clean clothes and had soft hands. They were strangers in a land that was supposed to be their own. The challenge of the immediate, establishing footing. Captain Jedediah Stone's final act of leadership was organizing the distribution of the surviving stock and the final accounting. His voice, though weary, carried its last note of authority. "We are here, but we are not settled," Jedediah announced to the gathered survivors. "The land is good, but the law is thin, and the winter is coming. We must build." The final division. The remaining 45 families held a solemn final meeting to distribute the few remaining community assets. The reserve oxen, saved from the river, and the thief were divided among the neediest families, given to those who still had large plots of land to clear. Doc Healy's medical supplies, carefully inventoried, were sold to the Oregon City doctor for a sum of money divided among the widows and the most destitute, including Thomas. Thomas received a small but vital sum. He immediately spent it on two essentials: a new, sturdy axe and a replacement for his beloved draw knife, tools that represented the rebirth of his trade and the start of his labor. The claim. His first true act as a free man in Oregon was to claim his land. Following the dictates of the provisional government, Thomas rode Healy's mule 2 days south into the valley. He staked his claim near a small, winding river, a prime piece of 640 acres of fertile, timbered land. He drove the wooden stakes into the soft, yielding soil, his hands shaking not from cold, but from the monumental realization of his success. Standing on his own ground, a profound sense of ownership washed over him. He was no longer a journeyman cooper or a dependent foot soldier. He was Thomas Hale, landowner. The new beginning, a life built on scars. Thomas immediately began the frantic labor of building his future. He helped Elias Vance and Sarah stake their own claim nearby, and the two men, their bond forged in the crucible of the trail, worked side by side to fell the first trees for their respective cabins. The cabin and the seeds. Building the first cabin was not an act of skill, but an act of will. Using his axe and his few remaining tools, Thomas worked from dawn until dusk, driven by the fear that the first snow would find him without shelter. He was lean, hardened, and tireless. His most treasured possessions were the seeds he had saved, Clara's inheritance. In the first cleared patch of rich black soil, Thomas planted a small patch of wheat and corn, marking the start of his agricultural dream. He did so with a sense of ceremony, praying over the seeds, dedicating them to the memory of his sister and the future he was building. The fate of the others revealed the final costs of the journey. Elias and Sarah thrived. They were pioneers in their element, building a strong cabin and immediately integrating into the burgeoning community. Their bond with Thomas was unbreakable. He was the godfather of their children, a silent, essential member of their family.
Elizabeth Blackwood, now free from her disastrous marriage, found work as a school teacher in Oregon City. She exchanged her lost dreams of wealth for the dignity of labor, her idealism finally tempered into a quiet, functional service to the new community. Doc Healy kept his word. He sold his medical instruments for passage money and disappeared north toward the Canadian border, his secret uncompromised. He left behind a small, final note for Thomas. "Find peace in the soil, Hale. I will find it in the silence." Silas Thorne, who had been delivered to the settlement as a prisoner of conscience, was shunned. He was stripped of his belongings and given a choice: leave the territory entirely or live out his days performing manual labor under the harsh judgment of the pioneers. He took the latter, working as a broken, isolated figure, a living monument to the ultimate price of greed. Enduring scars, the cost of progress. The first winter in the Willamette Valley was harsh, but Thomas survived it. He had a roof over his head, food in his belly, and a clear, quiet dignity earned by his own hands. One evening, sitting alone by his hearth fire, Thomas finally allowed himself to reflect on the enduring scars of the journey, the true cost of his progress. The physical scars. His hands were no longer soft and stained with Cooper's tannin. They were permanently calloused, scarred by rope burns and the frozen cold of the high country. His shoulders ached with the memory of the human chain. The financial scar. He was poor. He had less money now than he did in Cincinnati, having spent or traded everything for survival. But this was a superficial scar. He had learned that wealth was not measured in coin, but in capability. The moral scars. He carried the weight of the moral compromises, the public shame of Elias, the necessary abandonment of Robert Blackwood, the silence surrounding Doc Healy, and the knowledge that he himself had used a dying man's animal for food. These were not acts of villainy, but acts of necessity, and they had permanently altered his soul, making him harder, more guarded, and fiercely pragmatic. The emotional scar. The unseen dead. He never forgot the silence of the graves dug in the middle of the trail, the children lost to fever, and the deliberate, magnificent sacrifice of Esther Jenkins, who had saved the life of the entire column. Thomas realized that he was not an independent success. He was a survivor of a collective effort, his life purchased by the sacrifices of those who fell. He took out the last tangible remnant of his past, the small, empty apple preserves jar that had once held Clara's gift, now thoroughly cleaned. It was a perfect, finished container, representing the life he had left behind, a life of small, neat perfection. He looked around his log cabin, rough-hewn, smoky, and built entirely by his own labor. It was imperfect, scarred, and strong. Thomas gently placed the copper coins he had saved into the jar and sealed it. He would use the money to purchase an advertisement in a newspaper heading east, sending a message to Clara. Not a letter of complaint or sorrow, but a simple, factual declaration. Hale, T., settled Willamette Valley. Land claimed, have planted the seeds. I have found the freedom. Do not worry. He had paid the price of progress with nearly everything he owned, but in return, the Unforgiving Trail gave him the greatest reward. It had turned a restless man into a pioneer, a dependent worker into a landowner, and an idealist into a survivor. Thomas Hale, the cooper, was gone. Thomas Hale, the Oregon man, had been born in the crucible of the West, his new beginning defined by the enduring scars of the journey. The physical journey was over, but the great lifelong challenge of building a new civilization on the bones of the old had just begun.